Hello, I'm Robert, voluntary fact checker and helping if you're scared of many things. And this was actually quite a minor positive, if it's anything. But it was falsely run by the BBC as if it was a negative. And they said completely mistaken things about Zelensky. And I'll explain these symbols in a bit. It says it was false, it was twisted, and there were serious omissions. That's what those three groups of symbols mean here. So I'll talk about, first of all, it's a reasonably positive development actually, because I talk about that down here. Orban is far right and pro-Russia, but he also wants an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine. And he is the only European leader who has talked to Putin in Moscow since the war started. And it's not impossible, because of his closeness with Putin, that he could be the key to finally getting a ceasefire across the line. So he said he's got some ideas to present to Trump. So that's what I'm talking about being a minor positive here. And then Hungary got its exemption from the oil embargo, which was no surprise to anyone, because Hungary, it's only a tiny amount of the oil that Russia actually sells. And they generally have difficulty, so it only imports 2.2% of Russian oil. And it's generally difficulty substituting for Russian oil, because it's got the need to import the oil overland from a seaport in Croatia if it tries to get it from the sea. So Zelensky has never objected to that. And Zelensky wants an immediate ceasefire. He's already said that in October, that if Viktor Orban is able to arrange for a summit that generally leads to progress, then he's all for it. And he said he wants an immediate ceasefire for at least a year now. So let's go and look, first of all, the Kiev Independent. Now, if there was anything that was even saying anything negative about Viktor Orban is not popular in Ukraine. And this would be, certainly the Kiev Independent would run any story with Zelensky saying negative things about Orban. And there's nothing there in Kiev Independent news. And Kiev Independent said they went through these things, that US granted Hungary an exemption, which of course is true. The difficulty in getting the oil and gas, they just say that Trump explained that. They gave no comment on that, because that also is true. That they expected the war to end soon. They also presented that without any comment. They just said that's what Trump and Orban said. And that Zelensky said in October that he welcomes any summit in Hungary if it helps to end the war sooner. So the Kiev Independent added that as well. And those are serious omissions, because the BBC didn't mention any of this. The BBC didn't even mention there was any reason for Trump to grant an oil exemption to Hungary. They didn't, in that broadcast that I watched, they didn't say that. They presented it as if Trump was just saying, look, I'm friendly with Orban, I like the chap, so I'll give an exemption. It wasn't that at all. There was serious reasons for it. They didn't mention that they both think the war will end soon. The BBC didn't mention that Orban presented ideas to Trump to help end the war, and they never mentioned that Zelensky welcomed the summit in Hungary in October. So what did they do instead? The BBC presented a quote from Zelensky as if it was about Trump's exemption, but it wasn't. That's false and twisting the facts and very misleading out of context. They claimed that the aim of the sanctions is to reduce numbers of missiles that Russia fires at Ukraine. I'll come down to the actual transcript in a minute. You can see what they said. And that's false. It twists the truth. It's extremely misleading. Sorry. Yes. And that they claimed that the money that Russia gets from selling the oil to Hungary goes directly to buy missiles to fire at Ukraine. And that's also false, twists the truth, and extremely misleading. The aim of the sanctions is a ceasefire, and it will not have any impact on the number of missiles. Putin has got stacks of money that they have in their own domestic reserves, which would be able to keep the war going for at least some months, even if he was selling no oil whatsoever. So there's no way that cutting the sales of oils would directly affect the ability to make missiles to fire at Ukraine. And that's not the aim. The aim is to persuade Putin to stop the war and to deal with all his finances in that way. So now let's go and look at it. First of all, if you can go, you can read this page. I'll put it in the video description. You can go through, and I've just put in bold all the things that Kiev Independent said, and you can check that I've summarised it correctly, each one. And they say nothing more except just what I've summarised. And that's it. And a few other things they say that are left out, but there's nothing that in any way supports anything the BBC said. Now, this is Zelensky's speech that the BBC misreported. So I need to give you a bit of background here. He's not going to explain certain things in this speech because he's talking in Ukrainian to Ukrainians in his daily speech to Ukraine. He's not doing a speech in English or even in Ukrainian, being interviewed by international TV journalists or anything like that. His audience knows that Zelensky has been asking for an immediate ceasefire along the current lines for the last year. His audience knows that all the sanctions and pressure on Russia will drop as soon as Putin stops fighting. So he doesn't need to explain these things to them. And so he said to them, pressure on Russia is still insufficient, and any weakening within the already existing formats of pressure only encourages Putin to prolong the war. And that is what the BBC took out of context. He did not link this to Viktor Orban, he did not link this to Hungary or Trump or to the exemptions. And that's the official transcript of what the BBC used. And then he does use emotive words such as Russian brazenness and strips of all means of existence. And so much pressure, so much support for life. I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe support for life in Ukraine. And that Russia is stripped of all means of existence in wartime. But this does not mean that he wants the Russians to starve. It's nothing like that. He just wants the Russian government to have its funding for the war cut off. So that if then his objective is to persuade Putin to a ceasefire and then all the sanctions stop and Russians benefit greatly from this, as do the Ukrainians. And I'll come to this in a minute. Zelensky has a warm place in his heart for the Russians. He actually started his career as a comedian by winning competitions in Moscow. And he is Russian speaking, it's his first language. I'll come to that towards the end of this video. So the idea that he might be opposed to want to harm individual Russians or is anyway wanting to harm Russia is not true whatsoever. And the West is very misleading sometimes in that respect in how they run the news. So, and then this is not something new. Just to say, give an idea, Zelensky says this several times a week in some form or another. So just the day before the Viktor Orban met with Trump, he said the fact that Russians continue targeting energy facilities and civilians shows once again that the pressure is still insufficient. He said that the day before. So him saying that was not a response to Viktor Orban or Trump. So here's how they mistakenly reported. So something which did not go down well in Kiev, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. None. I check all the mainstream news. I checked Associated Press, or a selection of the mainstream news. Associated Press, I checked France 24. I've checked the BBC Sky News. BBC's the only one that did this. I checked the where else did I check? I checked TASS. TASS didn't say this. That's the BBC, Russian propaganda. Nobody said that except the BBC. Right across the spectrum. So here's an annotated version of the BBC interview. So they said the strikes came only hours after Donald Trump met the Orban. That's true. But they gave the false impression that somehow Trump meeting Orban was the reason for the strikes. But those strikes just the day before, on the 6th, in eastern Ukraine, and there have been strikes from Kiev several times this week, very frequent anyway. And then I think Kindred Leader is better than ally, but actually the Kiev Independent use the same term, so I suppose it's okay to call him an ally. But it's not a military ally, just to make clear about that, except that he's part of NATO. So in that respect, but not in terms of the policy on Ukraine. And then he said, Zelensky's speech taken out of context, because it said something which did not go down well in Kiev, then gave Zelensky speaking as this evidence it didn't go down well in Kiev. So that's very twisted and misleading and out of context, because he wasn't even talking about it. So that is nothing to do with that. That claim is not supported by that, because he wasn't talking about Hungary at all. And then they go on to say, although it came very close to home last night, it didn't come any closer to home in Ukraine last night than several times this week, probably. I can't remember when the last thing, but it's very frequent that and certainly the electricity was, they've got rolling power cuts in Kiev every day now, I think, because of the, as a direct result of the, as a direct result of the missile attacks, which have completely destroyed, again, Ukraine's entire fossil fuel power supply. It just got the nuclear power plants, the hydropower plants, and it supplies from Europe to keep going now. All the fossil fuel power plants have been destroyed, and this has happened before, and it's happened again now. That's the point we are at just now. They've all been destroyed yet again for about the third or fourth time since the war started. And so that's nothing to do with the Trump and Orban meeting. And then they said debates about sanctions can sometimes appear technical and political, but for people here they're very real. If Russia can continue to sell oil to Hungary, can use the money to build more drones and missiles to fire at Ukraine, like the ones that flew through the skies of Ukraine last night. This gave the very false, misleading, twisted impression that the debates about that the sanctions were intended to stop the missiles, to reduce the number of missiles. That is not the aim of sanctions whatsoever. Nobody is saying that. So what was going through that reporter's mind when he said that? I don't understand it. How can experienced reporters say such things which are completely false? So I don't think that, I think that they are just thinking what is going to be shared virally on the internet. And they're just focused on the words and how the words could be shared virally. And I think they disconnect with actual reasoning, because the reasoning doesn't make sense. These aren't the words of someone who's thinking rationally. Not if they're not given the background of what they know, they have to know. That nobody says that. None of their sources would say that to them. So they're just producing words that they expect will be shared virally, I think. I think that's what's going on there. But my hypothesis, the news reporting on Ukraine and on the BBC generally has changed hugely in the last 3 or 4 years. They no longer just present facts. I think they've always got the mind of, they don't have a captive TV audience anymore. That's the problem. So people don't just sit at home and watch TV. They find it on their mobile phone, clips from the BBC that are shared. So it's always about how can we say something that could become a viral clip. So I think that's what's going on. Anyway, for whatever the reason, this is really very typical of the BBC recording of the Ukraine for the last year at least, year or two. And so now the oil revenue here actually, it funds the Russian government. It doesn't fund the war directly. The Russian government then uses that, spent on numerous things throughout Russia. So there's no way you can say that Hungary, by buying oil, is funding missiles. It's just providing money for the Russian government. And then the idea is that, and then if Hungary stops supplying the oil, then the Russian government has lots of money. It's got domestic reserves as well as the foreign reserves which are frozen, because we've got domestic reserves which last for quite a long time, which it can use to buy as many missiles as it likes. So it's a very indirect connection with actually buying the missiles to the government, especially when you compare to mind, even if you stopped all the oil, Russia would keep on paying for these missiles. So that's why it's just so misleading. And nobody that I follow, none of the experts are suggesting that you can reduce the number of missiles that are falling on Ukraine by reducing the amount of oil that Russia sells. Instead, the idea is that this war is extremely expensive, and Russia is finding it difficult to keep going, and it is digging into its domestic reserve to a certain extent anyway. And if the oil sales were completely stopped, then not even completely stopped, if say half of the oil sales were stopped to foreign countries, that would be equal to the price of the war. And it's an extremely expensive war, and then the actual Russian foreign reserves would go down a cliff. But it would take several months to reach zero, the domestic reserves. But then there would be a lot of pressure on Putin and the Kremlin, because other people in the Kremlin will be saying, look, our reserves are going down, down, down all the time. And this war is extremely expensive. Isn't it time to stop it? So that is the idea of the sanctions. Nobody is suggesting that the sanctions would immediately stop, make it impossible for Russia to fight. But they would make it politically difficult for Putin to keep up with the war, because it would be costing so much. And because he would find it very difficult to get another source of income to replenish the funding, and so he'd be eating into the Russian and domestic reserves. So that's the idea of the sanctions. So now if we've got that background of how the sanctions are working, what the point is, then Hungary imports only 2.2% of the Russian oil. And if you go and look at who's buying the Russian fossil fuels, then Zelensky is never talking about Hungary. When he's talking about the sanctions, he talks about China, he talks about India. Other countries that are relevant are Turkey and Brazil. They also, and the EU as well. But so the EU pipeline gas and liquid natural gas, they've managed to greatly reduce the crude oil. I suppose Hungary might be counted onto the EU in there, come to think of it. So yes, so Hungary would be in there, but it's only 2.2%, so it's just a tiny fraction of a percent of all the oil. Sorry, I just noticed that just now. So yes, Hungary would be there amongst the EU, and it's only part of the EU. And yeah, so it is in there, but it's just a tiny little bit. 2.2% would be somewhere. I don't know. It would just be. You could hardly see it. That would be the Hungarian supply of oil. And certainly Zelensky is not talking about Hungary at all. So not in respect of the oil sanctions. And then this is to explain why Hungary, it's quite difficult for Hungary. So Hungary is landlocked, and it gets oil, of course, 87%, whatever it was, I think I said up there, 86% of its oil comes from Russia that way. And the remaining 14% of its oil mainly comes through Croatia, I think. So the question is about the capacity of the pipeline from Croatia to Hungary, and also prices that Slovakia is charging. And Viktor Orban, Slovakia claims that through an improvement in technology, they've managed to find a way to reduce the turbulence. So when the oil is flowing through a pipeline, it flows through much more smoothly and faster if it hasn't got turbulence, the eddies which slow it down. So Slovakia claims to have solved this problem of turbulence, and that it claims that as a result, it can get enough oil through its pipelines to supply Hungary with everything it needs, and it's offering to sell enough oil for Hungary. However, it's selling this oil at a high price, and Hungary doesn't believe this claim that it'll be able to push all that oil through the pipeline. So that is the background to this controversy. And Zelensky is just keeping out of this. And Trump has clearly decided to give Hungary the benefit of the doubt and said to Hungary, well, look, we understand that you can't import your oil from Slovakia and we'll give you a year to transition. So that's basically what's happening here, and that's behind the scenes. There is a controversy there, but it's about how much oil Slovakia can push through the pipeline to Hungary, and with different points of view on whether they can do it or not. And Hungary doesn't believe they can, and also thinks their prices are too high. So, so anyway, it's certainly not easy for Hungary to have any, because it's got no coastal access. It's dependent on Croatia, and Trump is sympathetic and Zelensky is not saying anything. So now I just wanted to end by talking about Zelensky and his comedy troupe. They were very popular in Russia at the start of the century, and this is basically how Zelensky got his millions. He got $20 million in his wealth before he became president. He got his leg up in that as a very popular in Russia, in Moscow. It was a big hit in Moscow in 2001, 2002. And here's him. He's actually performing in Moscow here as part of his dancing troupe. They did the Beatles song Yesterday in the middle of this, which they sang it straight but with a little bit of Ukrainian humour added to it, with Zelensky playing the guitar and a Ukrainian singer with singing in Russian. And they also had this obviously saying funny things about Russian and Ukraine, and I don't really understand, because I think you'd have to speak Russian to understand the humour there. But you can see that the audience found it very funny, and they certainly weren't put off in any way by it. So it's good humoured ripping of Russia and Russian-Ukrainian attitudes was what ideas about Ukraine. And he ends this song saying, even though they're Moscow, which apparently is a good humoured kind of ripping of Russians, that they also like their food, and who loves their food, Ukrainian food, and that the whole world will sing this song with us, and that everywhere people will be amazed about there's not enough food for us in the whole universe. So that's the song at the end, this comedy sketch that they did, which basically that was basically the source of his humour, was good humoured ribbing about Russian attitudes to Ukraine and Ukrainian attitudes about Russia, and so that's what he used to. That's what got him started on his career as a comedian, and then later on he ran as a comedic version of a president who rails against corruption in Ukraine, and then he becomes a real president who is very anti-corruption in Ukraine, fighting corruption in Ukraine, but through his popularity as a comedic president. So got a really quite interesting past, but he'll have many friends in Russia, and he'll have a soft heart with the Russians because they got him started on his career as a comedian. And now, and once the war gets over, the Ukrainians and Russians have a lot in common. They have a shared culture. They have ideas in the language. Many Ukraine speak Russian as a first language. They're very familiar with Russian literature, with Russian culture, and so on. But they also have Ukrainian as a second language in the Russian part. And Zelensky himself came from a village, a small town, not a village, somewhere. Where is it? See if I can find it. Somewhere around there, I think, in quite strongly Russian-speaking area of Ukraine. I may have got in the wrong place, but he was close to Kherson Oblast and quite a Russian speaker, strongly Russian speaking. His first language is Russian, and in the presidential elections, he got landslide victory, almost all of Ukraine, including a lot of the Russian-speaking areas. But the very strongly pro-Russian party got the Donbass area and a couple of other regions, run by Yuri Boyko. And then in the second round, all those regions switched to Zelensky. And then this region, it was the former president of Russia. And the opposition party, Yuri Boyko, he as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, then the members of his party joined the territorial defense of Ukraine en masse to protect the infrastructure, civilian structure, housing, fight looters, and they did everything, and they did everything to help our civilians in this terrible time. He wrote on Facebook, "We will defend Ukraine." So he was certainly not in support of Zelensky. So the idea that Zelensky has some mandate from this election to invade Ukraine is utterly wrong. The Russians, the Ukrainians as people, including in the Russian-occupied the Donbass area, they voted for candidates who were completely opposed to Putin's invasion. So please don't believe Putin's misinformation, claiming that the Russians in Donbass area wanted him to invade them and bomb their cities and destroy their towns and flatten their industries and so on. Why would they want that? They didn't. So, so as soon as the war is over, then so even most of the very pro-Russian Ukrainians do not like being bombed. And having occupied Donbass, then Putin is actually taking them, conscripting them, and getting them to fight against Ukrainians and forcing them into the war against Ukrainians, which is actually a war crime. When you occupy an area, you shouldn't conscript them. You could get volunteers to fight for you, but you're not permitted to conscript people that you've occupied. But that's what Putin is doing, sadly. So that's very much against the international law to do that. But that's what he's doing. Anyway, so Zelensky and the Ukrainians are not anti-Russian. They're just opposed to Putin bombing their country. And why wouldn't they be? And invading and killing their civilians and demolishing their homes and destroying their way of life, and taking over their farms, stealing their crops, destroying the industries that they've built up, forcing them to evacuate their cities. So that's why Ukraine is opposed to Putin. They're not opposed to Russia. And as soon as the war is over, then the healing can begin. And there'll be many in Russia have no idea what's going on. And there are many Russians also who are very in favour of, who are opposed to Putin because they do know what's going on. So there's a great opportunity for healing as soon as the war is over. And they have a huge amount in common with ordinary Russians, but they want to be able to sing their Ukrainian anthem, to follow their Ukrainian traditions, go to church and worship in the Ukrainian way of the Eastern Orthodox rather than the Russian Eastern Orthodox, just because that's what they want, that's what they're used to. They just want to follow Ukrainian traditions. And then I thought I'd end with some other nice things. So and then I'll stop. So just this is showing, I think when you've been after being through thinking of stuff like this, it might be quite healing to just watch a few videos of ordinary Ukraine. Now this is actually interesting. I should add that to that post. This is actually Zelensky's birthplace. Kryvyi Rih, probably not saying it quite right, but there's a cafe there is allowing the children to buy hot chocolate if they bring in leaves from the trees, autumn leaves. So there's a nice little video of this little girl. She brings in a kind of purse or wallet full of autumn leaves and offers that, and the lady accepts it and gives her a cup of hot chocolate. So it's just a way to brighten up their lives during the war. And then here's some video photographs. So let's try to help you end in a positive way. So this is Yaroslava, and she's a lady does lots of photographs, and she writes. I think she's been posting these posts, and I've been following her pretty much since the war began, which brings out the positive side of all the good things that she sees around her and how peaceful most of Ukraine is despite the bombing. So that's her message, that life is going on in Ukraine, that peaceful things are happening in Ukraine. Most of Ukraine is at peace, except she talks about how when she's in a bomb shelter and she showed us some things from her in a bomb shelter and about the electricity power cuts and so on. But most of her focus is on the positive, beautiful things that she sees around her in her life, and the importance of keeping of remembering all this and showing this beauty to the world. Like your eyes deserve a rest from the sad images you often see from here, and so she shows you beautiful things from Ukraine. So this is quite a good counterbalance, I think. And so there she's going through Ukraine, and she has the sound of the generators as she's going to work, and then there's the sound of it at night. And she talks about how the generators are singing, and so this is something. It's called art concrete. So I think, and it's about seeing beauty and seeing art in everyday things, and hearing the sound of generators as being like music. Although they're diesel generators, they have to run because the diesel generators are what they need for power. But you can listen to this and you can hear this kind of music in the sound of the generators. As you say, the generators are singing in this part of Kiev. So you keep seeing the beauty and showing it to you to inspire you to look around, to remind you how beautiful Kiev is. That goes on, and this child playing cheerfully with bubbles in Kiev proves it. Another night was calm, and a beautiful Sunday, and another the beauty of Kiev when it's almost in the evening a moment from yesterday and so on. So this might be quite healing for the mind, is to go and visit these page. So you've got her Sunday letters, and then if you go to Patreon, look at the ones that don't say they're locked. You can unlock other ones if you want to pay a monthly subscription, but you can just go and look at a lot of it for free. So this might be healing for some of you who've been hearing over and over these false things about the Ukraine war and things. So I think I'll just end there, and so you could go and look at the blog post in the video description. And so I've ended with a kind of positive thing here, which I hope hopefully will help with your frame of mind. So it's actually quite a good positive thing that actually happened, that Viktor Orban actually may possibly have some ideas, that he has shared some ideas with Trump. He does want a ceasefire. He's very keen on the ceasefire. And Zelensky is absolutely fine with meeting Putin in Hungary, if that is the way forward. There's no way that they're kindred souls or anything like that. And there's lots of things Zelensky doesn't like about the politics of Hungary, and Hungary doesn't like about the politics of Ukraine. But if Viktor Orban can get ceasefire, then Zelensky's all for it. So really, and just to say, I don't think I've said it in the video so far, so I'll just mention it. I've said it several times before, but hope you can bear it being repeated, that the majority in Ukraine want the war to stop along the current line. The majority in Russia, also in polls taken in Russia, want to stop along the current line. The Ukrainians want an immediate ceasefire right now. All of Ukraine's allies want an immediate ceasefire right now. Even Orban in Hungary wants an immediate ceasefire right now. Many in Russia want a ceasefire as well. So it's really just one man, Putin. And it's to try to persuade Putin. And he's not making progress in this war. He's going about twice the speed of a garden snail at the fastest pace, which is in Donbass. Along the entire Dnieper River, the Russian army has not been able to cross the river for 3 years. They're just stuck on the far side. So it's pretty much a stuck war. And it's just really about when is Putin going to decide to stop. And when he does, there's loads of positive things for Russia, as I said. And all the beauty of Kiev, they're going to go back to peace. And at some point, maybe could even be tomorrow, or more likely it'll be some weeks from now, But at some point this war will end. Then it'll be history, like the Gulf War, like the Iraq War. And then peace comes after that. And then rebuilding of Ukraine. And then lots of positive things coming out from that. The healing of relations with Russia. All that is going to happen in the future. And then you all look back on this. And that's what it is. Well, I think I should just go back to the... Yes, I should, but most of you have already seen this. So, just to say, Russia is not going to attack NATO. Admiral Radkin said that, and it's very, very clear it's not going to attack NATO. We're not to risk it of a world where we're moving in the direction of more peace and stability, and why Putin will never use nukes, and why we do not risk a world war from Ukraine, Middle East, China, North Korea, or anywhere else in the world. It's next to impossible. So I've got those videos there to help you there as well. But yeah, I think let's use that as the final video of the Russians shelling the cafe and the Ukrainian children in the cafe buying their hot chocolate with autumn leaves. And there's lots of beauty and lots of peace and kindness in the world. And try to relate that to that more and not to worry about all this stuff, which is just journalists being journalists and saying things that are not true. And that's really what's happening here.